Why walking away became the most profitable move. At the moment it happened, it looked irrational, almost irresponsible, like a retreat disguised as a decision. Opportunities were visible, momentum was building, and expectations were clear. Yet one choice cut against all of it, abandoning a path that everyone else believed was about to pay off. This story matters today because modern success narratives rarely acknowledge the power of refusal. We celebrate expansion, persistence, and relentless commitment, especially in markets that reward those who appear fearless and constantly in motion. But beneath that surface logic lies a quieter truth. Sometimes the most valuable position is not the one you fight hardest to keep, but the one you choose to leave before its hidden costs reveal themselves. The decision to walk away did not come from panic or loss of confidence. It came from a clear-eyed assessment of asymmetry. The upside was visible and limited. The downside was diffuse, delayed, and capable of compounding far beyond initial projections. What others saw as an opportunity, one player saw as a trap slowly forming under optimistic assumptions. At the time, the signals were subtle: rising complexity, increasing dependency on external conditions, commitments that reduce flexibility while promising future scale. None of these factors alone justified exit. Together, they suggested a future where control would erode long before rewards arrived. Walking away meant forfeiting near-term gains. It meant disappointing partners, confusing observers, and absorbing criticism framed as caution or fear. But it also preserved something far more valuable: the ability to choose again later, under better terms, with clearer information. What made the move powerful was not the exit itself, but its timing. It happened before costs were obvious, before alternatives disappeared, and before stay became the only socially acceptable option. By leaving early, one player avoided a game whose rules were quietly shifting against anyone still inside. And as the market continued forward, confident and committed, the consequences of that decision began to unfold in ways no one had anticipated. After the exit, the immediate reaction across the market was confusion mixed with quiet dismissal, because walking away disrupted a narrative that everyone else needed to believe in. Partners reassured themselves that the departure was an outlier decision, a personal miscalculation, or a temporary repositioning that would soon be reversed once reality set in. Confidence remained high precisely because most participants were already too invested, financially and psychologically, to seriously reconsider their own positions. Inside the remaining ecosystem, commitment deepened. Those who stayed doubled down, not necessarily because conditions improved, but because leaving now would have meant acknowledging that the original assumptions might have been flawed. New resources were allocated. Timelines were extended. Risk was reframed as patience. Every additional investment made withdrawal more difficult and made the early exit look increasingly unnecessary in the short term. Meanwhile, the one who had walked away gained something subtle but powerful: distance. Without ongoing exposure, analysis became clearer. Signals that were easy to ignore from inside the system became obvious from the outside. Rising operational friction, increasing reliance on fragile variables, and creeping misalignment between incentives and outcomes all became easier to see once emotional attachment was removed. As months passed, cracks began to form that insiders struggled to explain convincingly. Returns lagged projections. Complexity slowed execution. External dependencies introduced volatility that planning models had not accounted for. What had once looked like a straightforward path to scale now required constant adjustment just to maintain momentum. The exit began to look less like abandonment and more like insulation. By stepping away early, one player avoided being locked into decisions that demanded continuous justification rather than delivering clear progress. While others spent time defending why staying still made sense, the one who left could observe, recalibrate, and wait. Waiting in this case was not passive. It was strategic patience, combined with the freedom to re-enter elsewhere. Capital remained liquid. Reputation remained intact. Options remained open. And as conditions continued to evolve, the gap between those who could still choose and those who could not began to widen, quietly but decisively. After the decision to walk away became public, the immediate response across the market was a mix of confusion, disbelief, and quiet dismissal. because the exit disrupted a story that many others needed to remain true in order to justify their own continued commitment. Partners reassured themselves that the move was temporary, emotional, or driven by private constraints rather than strategic insight, telling one another that no rational actor would abandon a position just as momentum appeared to be building. Confidence remained high largely because too many participants were already invested financially, reputationally, and psychologically to seriously question the foundation beneath their assumptions. Inside the ecosystem that remained, commitment intensified rather than weakened. Those who stayed increased their exposure, not necessarily because conditions improved, but because leaving now would have required admitting that early optimism might have been misplaced. Additional resources were allocated, timelines were extended, and risks were reframed as long-term vision, all in an effort to preserve belief in an outcome that still felt attainable if everyone simply stayed patient enough. Each new layer of investment made withdrawal more difficult, binding participants more tightly to a future that depended on factors increasingly outside their control. From the outside, however, the picture looked very different. The one who had walked away gained distance, and with that distance came clarity that is almost impossible to achieve from within a system that demands constant defense of past decisions. Patterns that insiders explain away as temporary friction became easier to see as structural issues. Operational complexity grew faster than capability. Dependencies multiplied. Assumptions hardened into constraints. As time passed, the gap between narrative and reality widened. Returns began to lag projections. Execution slowed under the weight of coordination. External conditions introduced volatility that planning models had underestimated or ignored entirely. What once looked like a straightforward path to scale now required constant justification just to appear stable, forcing participants to spend more energy explaining the present than preparing for the future. The exit started to look less like abandonment and more like insulation. By stepping away early, one player avoided being locked into a system that demanded ongoing commitment without delivering proportional control, while others worked to defend why staying still made sense. The one who left could observe without pressure, recalibrate without cost, and wait without consequence. That waiting was not passive. It preserved flexibility. Capital remained uncommitted. Reputation remained intact. And most importantly, the freedom to choose again under better conditions remained fully available. As the market continued forward, confident and invested, the distance between those who could still move freely and those who could not grew wider, setting the stage for a shift that few inside the system were prepared to face. The conflict became unavoidable when external pressure finally exposed how fragile the committed positions had become, forcing participants to confront the difference between momentum driven by optimism and progress supported by structure. What had once been explained as temporary setbacks now accumulated into persistent strain, making it increasingly difficult to maintain the narrative that staying the course would eventually justify the growing costs. Inside organizations that remained committed, decision-making slowed under the weight of obligation. Every adjustment required consensus. Every change risked undermining earlier assumptions. The deeper they went, the fewer viable exits remained, and the more each participant depended on everyone else continuing to believe. Coordination itself became a liability. From the outside, the contrast sharpened. The one who had walked away could respond to the same market conditions without constraint. Opportunities that required speed, flexibility, or selective exposure were accessible without hesitation, while others were locked into defending sunk costs. The exit had preserved freedom of movement at precisely the moment became rare. As pressure mounted, reactions inside the system grew defensive. Delays were justified as prudence. Losses were framed as investment. Warnings were softened to maintain confidence. But beneath those explanations sat a growing awareness that options were disappearing faster than results were improving. The emotional peak formed around a hard realization. Staying had stopped being a strategy and started being an obligation. Participants were no longer choosing to remain. They were trapped by commitments made under assumptions that no longer held. What once felt like conviction now felt like inertia. Attempts to reverse course emerged too late. Exits were costly. Restructuring introduced new risks. Coordination failures multiplied as incentives diverged. Meanwhile, the one who had left early faced none of these constraints, because the most expensive decision had already been avoided. The conflict was no longer about who was right. It was about who still had agency. In a system under stress, agency determines outcomes long before results become visible. And as the pressure continued to rise, the advantage of having walked away early became impossible to ignore. The climax arrived when the market finally forced a comparison that could no longer be avoided, revealing how differently outcomes unfold when commitment is optional for some and unavoidable for others. As conditions tightened and margins narrowed, those who had stayed found themselves reacting rather than choosing, adjusting within limits they could no longer redefine, while the one who walked away re-entered conversations on entirely new terms. What became clear in that moment was uncomfortable. The most profitable move had not been the boldest expansion or the longest endurance. It had been the refusal to stay when staying required surrendering future control. By exiting early, one player avoided compounding exposure, just as uncertainty began to harden into permanence. Inside the system, acceptance replaced confidence. Participants stopped talking about upside and started focusing on damage control. Strategies shifted from growth to survival, from vision to maintenance. The cost of leaving now was far higher than the cost of having left earlier, and everyone could see it, even if no one wanted to say it aloud. Meanwhile, the benefits of walking away continued to compound. Capital remained flexible. Reputation was untarnished by defensive explanations. Most importantly, optionality remained intact. When new opportunities emerged, free from the constraint of the old structure, participation was possible without negotiation, apology, or delay. This is why the story matters now, because in modern markets, profitability is often determined not by how long you stay committed, but by how carefully you choose what to commit to in the first place. Walking away is not failure when it preserves agency. It is strategy when it protects the future. We tend to celebrate perseverance without asking what it costs. But the most durable advantage often comes from recognizing when persistence turns into obligation, from understanding that exits, taken early and deliberately,